Today we're starting with medieval music, which like I said last time is from about the year 900 up until about the year 1500, which is a really long period of time, but everything is very slow moving in the world as a whole right now. You know, we're on the kind of curve of our technologies and advancements are going like this a little bit. They haven't quite gone to going like that yet. So this is a really long period of time. But 900 is a pretty decent starting point because it's right about here when we start to see some changes happening in the world that start to affect basically music from this point on. And it really has to do a lot with the church, because what we'll find in this era and the next one is you really can't do a lot of studying of these two eras without understanding some church history along with it. The two really went hand in hand, and then it's not until Baroque era and Classical era later on when the church starts losing its kind of influence over music as a whole that we start seeing less and less of the church. It's around this kind of time frame. It's roughly from 500 to 900. It's not exact in any way, but it's around those few hundred years when the church starts implementing some changes that really start to affect music long term. So we're going to start at the very beginning with Gregorian chants. So Gregorian chants are pretty iconic. Most people recognize them when they hear them. They sound very medieval to most people. And this is where the start of basically most things comes from. Now, the reason why Gregorian chant came about is because Pope Gregory I decided to kind of standardize the Catholic Church a little bit, and he wanted a lot of the little churches who were various factions to start to come together and celebrate, worship, church in the same kind of way. So they, like, if you would go from one church to the next, they were relatively similar. This is where we start seeing things such as a mass service. So, you know, if you've ever gone to mass, if you go to mass, or, you know, there's certain kinds of steps that are taken. There's certain kinds of sections they might read this kind of prayer and say this kind of thing or sing this kind of song. That's where these steps start to get put into place. And along with that, there are certain sections where something like a Bible verse might be read or a passage might be said, as well as certain lines being sung. In these early days of the church, it wasn't so much singing a song as we know it now, but it was kind of this chant singing. So it's singing, but it's one note at a time, and it doesn't tend to move too fast. It's kind of slow and meditative. Gregorian chants, I mean, look any Gregorian chant up and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. They're chants, not typically songs, but it's here where we start to have the development of Western music. So like I said, these chants were typically monophonic, not any instruments involved, because the church didn't like instruments. They kind of perceived that to be a little too closely related to a lot of paganistic rituals. So it's just a voice singing up on front of the church by themselves. Doesn't have to be a solo voice, but it can be a solo voice. It's just typically one melodic line at a time, and it's singing some kind of passage. And then typically when we're talking about a mass, the most commonly we'll refer to the parts that are part of the Mass Ordinary, or the ones that you'll see repeated over and over and over again. I'm not going to talk about the specialty ones that were sometimes brought up, but the most important ones, the Mass Ordinary, are the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus and Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei. And those aren't all there at the beginning, but they do eventually all become part of the standard repertoire. And so churches were singing this in the early days. They were using this as part of their liturgy, part of their church services, part of whatever was needed in their day-to-day kind of activities. And early on, there wasn't any kind of musical notation for people to be writing this stuff down. A lot of it's still pretty much you listen to it, you repeat it. It's by rote. But that takes a while, and if you're trying to standardize things across the board for your church, you're going to want to standardize things musically too. So in that 900 kind of era, most of the symbols for what's being written down are just sort of what we call neumes, or other kinds of symbols that just kind of give a vague representation of what the pitch might be or what the rhythm might be. It's certainly not standardized, it's certainly not across the board, and so it can be kind of difficult for us as modern people to understand exactly what we're looking at, because it changes slightly from one thing to the other, and there's nothing too specific with any of this music. Once we start hitting about the 11th century is when we finally start to see some kind of standardized notation start to come out. So before it was kind of depending on where you were, and now after about 100 years, for the most part, it's pretty standardized. Still very different than what we have today. It wouldn't really start to get to its final form until several hundred years later, but it's at least standardized for them at their time. And then even through all of this, the music that's being written is still pretty anonymous. We might see a few composer names pop up here and there, but it's not, the notation isn't standardized enough for the same people to be writing a bunch of compositions for us to see any kind of recognizable names. That doesn't really come about until about the 12th century. So you can understand why this is a really difficult era to study. Oftentimes when we look at this, we look at the various major composers or the various major works that are out there. And we really don't have either of those until much later on, towards the end of the medieval era. That's when we start seeing more recognizable composers, names popping up again and again and again. This is also where we have the bulk of our written down texts, because not only do they have difficulties surviving this long, but it's also a thing of it wasn't super standardized until nearly the very end of this era. But let's go back to the beginning of this era again. So we have Gregorian chant at the beginning. Like I said, monophonic, not any instruments, unaccompanied, can be multiple voices singing, but only one melodic line at a time. And that was just kind of how a lot of music existed back then. Even later on as it develops, we don't tend to see multiple melodic lines start to pop up until the composing technique called organum starts to be developed. Now, organum is this idea of you have your melodic line, so typically in a church setting, it's your Gregorian chant. Then you have a secondary line that kind of accents that first line in some kind of way. This can either be that it's a very slow moving line, so maybe the top one is really ornamented and it moves all over the place, and the bottom line is basically essentially just whole notes the entire way, or both lines move relatively at the same pace, but the bottom line will match it in like an interval, like note for note. The intervals they often used for organum, when they tried to match them up, were typically pretty open, perfect intervals. So fourths, fifths, and octaves. Anything beyond that, they didn't really care for too much. And which is why medieval music has this really distinct, recognizable kind of open, and I don't know if you might consider it a holy kind of sound, because it's these very, very open intervals. There's almost no dissonance whatsoever. But this technique of organum is really what sets the foundation for what will later on become polyphony, which will then evolve into other composing techniques that we know now. But it's the start of just these two lines, where we have one line being our official melody and the bottom line being kind of like a supporting line. It isn't exactly harmony and it isn't exactly polyphony. It's somewhere before that. Like I said, it's a predecessor to polyphony. And then of course, as this went on and this technique started to get developed more and more and more, we start to see the first few notable composers coming out, and writing a lot of songs using this organum technique. Composers such as Léonin or Perrotin are two really good examples during this kind of, is it the 1100s? So was that the 10th century? The 10th and 11th century? Yes? Yes? But these two composers are really great examples during this time where they use a lot of this organum technique. And of course, the later it goes on, the more voices we start adding. So it starts off typically with just 2 voices, but we do eventually expand to 3 or 4, and sometimes even more than that. In fact, Léonin is a composer who's really well known for writing a lot of this technique because he wrote this big, huge, gigantic book called the Magnus Liber, which is just this huge book full of compositions using this technique and almost kind of as an educational tool for other people to use too. You'll also see as you look at big composers from the medieval era that most of them are going to be coming from the Italian region, or like the Franco-Flemish kind of area in Europe. These were the two kind of main centers of where most of the medieval music is going to be coming out of. There was, of course, music from other places, but these were the two main hubs because these were the two main hubs for the church. Obviously, Rome is still the center of most Catholic churches, but also France with Notre Dame. And so a lot of the really early stuff is centered mostly around Italy, but once we start to get into the 12th and 13th century, that's when we start to get the technique known as Ars Antiqua start to come more from the France area. I say France area because obviously the countries back then didn't exist as we know them now. I can't strictly call it French because it's not French, it's sometimes Burgundy, sometimes this Franco-Flemish kind of area. That's probably the best way to describe it. So when we move into the 12th and 13th century with this whole Ars Antiqua kind of technique, it builds off of that idea of organum. So we have the slower moving lower parts and the faster moving upper parts. We're developing more lines of what will eventually become polyphony. But it's here that we really start to see an interesting development in the music. Songs are no longer just using one set of lyrics at a time. Now they're starting to combine multiple lines of text. It sounds really weird and it sounds like it'd be awful to listen to, but the composers really knew what they were doing and they were playing around with it. So even though the texts don't match, this is what helps develop that idea of polyphony. Because when we have polyphony, it is 2 separate melodic lines. The words don't have to match up with each other, but it still sounds really nice together. It's also around this time when we finally start to have a few more of our secular works popping up and being written down. The other thing you have to remember is not everybody could read and write at this time. So that's also going to affect people who are going to write and publish music, or what kinds of music is going to be written down. If the people who are performing secular music are not able to write it down or not able to read it, it's probably not going to be spread through any kind of written text. But once we hit about the 12th to 13th century, we do have a few more examples of secular music. So what did that look like? It does kind of start off more simplistically than, say, the music from the church, where a lot of it can be one line at a time. But just as the church music develops, so does the secular music. You can have multiple lines going on at a time, that kind of organum technique that I talked about, where you have a faster moving upper line or a slower moving lower line. The real key thing to remember here with this, though, is that secular music did use instruments, but they often didn't score them in the music. It was typically just the vocal line. So you could have just a solid vocal line singing by itself, or you could have a vocal line singing by itself with implied instruments, or you could have music that had several vocal lines being played, which could all be voices a cappella, or one could be voice and the rest could be instruments. You could really kind of mix it up however you wanted. There wasn't any rules like we might have in like like a symphony music of today, you know? You have your parts written out, these parts can only play these parts because of the ranges and the staffs, and there wasn't those kind of same restrictions back then. So it was kind of however you wanted to do it and perform it. And of course, unlike the church, who can really only use voices, you can really have a lot more freedom with your performance with secular medieval music because you can use instruments when the church bans them. So the last little kind of section we have right before we start to go into the Renaissance era is the Ars Nova Movement. And it's in this section when we probably have the biggest bulk of all our medieval music. If you're going to find something that's not Gregorian chant and you want to listen to medieval music, it's probably going to come from basically this last century. So the 14th century. It's probably mostly going to come from this last century in the 14th century because, of course, as our writing techniques are developing, as we're getting notable composers starting to appear, as we're developing our composing techniques, more people start coming out of the woodwork and more music starts coming out that we can have to look at and analyze. Now, don't feel bad if it's in this last kind of era that you start getting it confused with the beginning of the Renaissance era, which I'll talk about next week. Because even a lot of music scholars have a hard time distinguishing the two, because this transition from one era to the next is a very, very slow transition, even compared to with transitions from one era to the next in later years, because everything moved really slowly in terms of development. People don't travel that much. Communication is not very easy at this time, so it's going to take a very long time for things to start to change. But in the earlier years, there is still a little bit of distinction. Well, the earlier years of this last era movement thing. One really important composing technique that was kind of iconic of this Ars Nova era was the idea of isorhythmic composing techniques. So isorhythmic composing techniques is basically this idea that you have one kind of like little short rhythmic phrase and you repeat that over and over and over and over again throughout the song, but you use different notes each time. Sometimes more modern transcriptions of this medieval music will kind of have a bar to show where the different sections of this technique are, so you can see it over and over and over again. But this is different than the music that was coming before because there was no kind of patterns in the rhythm. It wasn't that the rhythm didn't exist, but it wasn't broken up into these little phrases over and over again. It's also during this time period that we start to see more of a blur between the parts. So if you remember before, I said a lot of the music was very slow moving lower parts and faster moving upper parts. Well, coming out of that Ars Antiqua into the Ars Nova era, we see the parts start to become more similar rhythmically and melodically too. And that is really what pushes us towards polyphony, which is huge during the Renaissance era. It's everywhere. It's what really leads a lot of the composing techniques in the Renaissance era. And that also sets up for other major genres that are prominent in the next era, like the motet and the madrigal, which are just all these big, huge polyphonic works. And then, of course, any kind of important composers you should know. So I'm gonna try to go from oldest to newest. So one of the oldest ones that's really interesting is Hildegard Von Bingen. She was a Germanic-ish composer, and probably the only woman composer that we know from the medieval era. It was, like I said, a lot of these compositions were coming from the church, so most of them are being written by monks, but this one was she was actually a nun, and she was in a convent, and she was writing all of this music. So she's a really interesting one to know about if that kind of thing interests you. Another one, like I said, was Léonin and Perotin. Those were the ones that were helping develop the idea of organum, and Léonin was the one that wrote the big, huge, basically manual on how to write with organum. Adam de la Halle, he's a more Franco-Flemish composer kind of thing, and he also wrote a lot of more secular songs. So he wrote some religious stuff, but he also wrote a ton of great secular examples. Guillame Dufay, he was a really well-known composer, probably the best one for that kind of Ars Nova composing technique and the iso-rhythmic kind of sections like I talked about. One of the best examples for that. And then a couple other really good examples are ones like John Dunstable. He was an English composer. And Guillame Dufay, however you say his name. He's another good example. Those last three are, like I said, from that kind of last final movement of the medieval era before we get into more Renaissance, and some of them kind of help more with that transition in between the two. I'm probably gonna pop up a couple of great song examples throughout this video for you to look at, and I'll do my best to list the names in the corner so you know what you're looking at, so you can have something to search. But I also wanted to, at the very end here, I'm gonna pop up onto the screen a fun little song because there's lots of these songs, like I said, are in Latin. Some French ones too. We don't see a ton of languages outside of that. Well, we do. We do, but not nearly to the extent that these two major languages are. But I wanted to share one quick example of an early English song, so Old English, so it's not officially true English, that you can look up and listen to. It's really cute. It's kind of like a song in the round thing where you can keep it going. But yeah, so check that song out. And that's probably the basic, like, need to know kind of information for the medieval era. So then next week, I'm going to take us from the medieval era and talk how it developed out of that, and then through the Renaissance and setting up for the Baroque era. So stay tuned if you would like to see that video and if you are interested. And then of course, if you aren't already and you do want to get that notification, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I also forget to tell people to ring the little notification bell. I guess if you're sticking with this whole series, that'd probably be a good thing to do. But yeah, subscribe to the channel and I will see you next time. Goodbye. Matchbox Hero City. Why is that stuck in my head? I don't know why that's stuck in my head. What do I say? Let's get going. Let's go. Let us begin. Let us begin. Let us begin. All the other... yes. The D3